So we have the token here in our auth class, or in the concrete object based on that class here in the main Dart file. And we use that token to find out that we're authenticated. Now that's nice, but we also need that token for all the requests we're sending to the backend. For example, to fetch our products, because right now this doesn't work. So we need to attach the token to outgoing requests. Good thing is that Firebase supports that. It makes it pretty easy to attach the token. All we have to do, for example, in the product start file where we have our fetch and set products method, which is the method failing here, there all we have to do is at the end of the URL, we have to add $of equals and then add our token here as an argument. Now, on other APIs, you might have to add a certain header which contains your token. That would, of course, also be possible on the HTTP method you're calling down there. Please always remember you can set your own headers. So with the headers extra argument here, you could provide a headers map basically to add extra headers to that outgoing request. But Firebase does not want the token in a special header, but in that so-called query parameter here at the end of the URL. So after that question mark, which is required, you can have an arbitrary amount of key value pairs, and Firebase will look for an auth key, and then the value should be your token. Now, of course, we can't hard code the token here because the token will be different for every user and every login. It's never the same token as before. So we obviously can't write it here into our code. That would render the whole login idea pretty redundant. So we can't add it here. We need to fetch it. But the problem is the token is in the auth Dart file. How do we get it into our product start file? Well, there is something we can do which we haven't done before. Products here is a normal class. So of course we could say that in there we actually want to have a property which is final maybe, which is our token. So in there we could have a string property which is the token or the auth token. Now to set this we can add the constructor. We haven't had a constructor here yet because we always created products and actually all our provider classes here without any arguments, but of course these are normal classes, so of course you can pass arguments to their constructors. So we can go to the product start file, add our constructor, and expect the auth token as the only value here, for example. And of course you could expect more values. So if we take it for granted that we received the token here, well then of course it's pretty easy to add it. It's now a property of this class. So here we can add $of, set this equal to, and then use string interpolation to point at our auth token. The only adjustment we need besides adding this is that this is now of course no longer compile time constant, but runtime constant, because that value, the token here, is dynamic. So we have to change this to final URL instead of const. The question just is, how do we actually get the concrete token into our class? Because we're creating products here, and this now expects the token. But the token is inside of auth, so how do we get the token out of auth into here? You could find complex solutions where you actually manage the token outside of the auth class here in the widget, and then you pass it to all your objects here, and also pass it to the auth constructor to use it in there, and that would be horrible. Thankfully, the provider package has an easy solution for this. Instead of using change notifier provider here, like this, you can use a different version of that. You can use the change notifier proxy provider. Now this doesn't have a value constructor, so instead you have to use that normal constructor with a builder, which I showed you earlier. And important, if you are using the provider package version 4 or higher, so if you're not using version 3, if you're using 4 or higher, then this is not builder, but update. Everything else I show works exactly the same way, but this is then update instead of builder. Previously it was create instead of builder with version 4. That was true for the normal change notifier provider. For the change notifier proxy provider, it's update instead of builder. So create instead of builder for the normal change notifier provider, update instead of builder for the change notifier proxy provider. And if you're using version 3, you of course can just use the code I'm showing in the videos. That's true anyways. And it forces you into that builder for a good reason, because that builder actually gives you a context, and then it gives you a dynamic value, and that dynamic value is the interesting part here. The context is simply a new context it generates for you. You can also use an underscore here, but we can also just give it a name. The dynamic part is the interesting part, because change notifier proxy provider actually is a generic class, and you should add the angle brackets here to give it an extra piece of information which it needs to work correctly. This allows you to set up a provider which itself depends on another provider which was defined before this one. So you have to make sure that your auth provider is the first one in the list, and then the other providers can depend on it. So here you can pass in auth, this auth class, and what the provider package will now do is it will have a look at your provider tree here basically, and will see if it finds a provider that provides an auth object before that provider, which it does here, and then it will take that auth object and give that to you here. So now that builder here actually will receive that auth object. And whenever auth changes, this provider here will also be rebuilt. Only this one, not the entire widget, not the other providers, but this provider will be rebuilt when this changes, because this here, this auth object is now a dependency of this provider. So it makes sense that this provider rebuilds. So a new products object here would be built when auth changes. Now actually you need to provide a second argument here. The first is the class, the type of data you depend on. The second is the type of data you will provide here, and that will of course be products. Previously for the value constructor we didn't have to do that, but for this proxy provider you do have to do that. Now the builder here also gives you a third argument, and that's your previous state, so your old products object, so previous product, so to say. And that is of course useful for maintaining our state. So here we return a new object of type products, and we pass in auth.token here. Now we have the token, but now we have to make sure that when this gets rebuilt and we create a new instance of products, we of course don't lose all the data we had in there before. Because in products, you must not forget that you had a list of your products. That was the key thing we were managing in there, the list of our items. Now, of course, it would be pretty bad if we would lose that list. So actually, what we want to do here is we want to make sure that we initialize this items as well as a second value. And now back in the main Dart file, you simply pass in previous products dot items here. Though please keep in mind that when this first is loaded, we don't have that. We have no items. And previous products is null when this is first initiated. So therefore we want to check if previous products is set, and if it is equal to null, so if it's not available, then I actually want to initialize this with an empty array, and only if it's not equal to null, I will access the previous products items here. So now this will create the products object with my token, and then either with an empty list of products or with the previous items we had. Now in case, by the way, you have more than one dependency, here we only have one, but if you had more than one, there are other versions of that constructor too. You have change notifier proxy provider 2, 3, 4, up the way to 6, for up to 6 dependencies you can specify. But here we only have one dependency, so we can use the base version. With that, if we save that and do a hot refresh, we should now be able to log in and then hopefully use that token when we fetch our products. So let's enter that, log in, take into that screen, and we successfully load our products and we see the products here again. So that's pretty nice. With that, we can use the token. Of course, we don't just need it for fetching the products, but that's an important first step. Definitely feel free to add the token to all other HTTP requests you're making from inside product start. And if you're really fancy, fix all the other providers where we need the token as well. In the next video, we'll do that together.